Thank you very much, Peter. What Peter says about the amount of constitutional change that's going on at the moment is absolutely right, and indeed he's given very neatly the first part of what I was going to say. So I shan't recap all of those, except to say that there are even more things that he didn't mention. Indeed, in the last few days, Parliament for the first time went through the process. I was going to say voted, but we didn't actually in the end vote on the basis of English votes for English laws, perhaps more appropriately described as English vetoes over English laws. And the only other thing which he didn't mention, no doubt because it's so obvious to all of us, is that all the constitutional reconfigurations that he described are against the background of a very important set of negotiations in the European Union and about our relationship with it, and a referendum to come, and indeed follow from the referendum which occurred in Scotland, and the very considerable shift in Scottish politics. So there's a clear background of a large amount of constitutional activity. Incidentally, I don't think that we should imagine that there is something particularly unusual about this, in the sense that actually the British Constitution, which incidentally isn't written down anywhere, as everybody knows, has been evolving for a very, very long time indeed. And I think it's one of the geniuses of our nation that it's able to evolve and absorb and meet the mood of the times in its constitutional arrangements in a way that has given us, possible exception of Sweden, I think the longest period of evolving, gradually widening franchise for liberal democracy of any country on earth. And I think we sometimes forget just how remarkable a tale that is, and just how extraordinarily beneficial for all of our fellow citizens and ourselves that's been. So I think those who think that there's something entirely surprising or unprecedented about constitutional evolution in Britain are simply not consulting the history books, and should do so. And I think also, finally on that front, I should say that I think people in Britain are peculiarly endowed, and have been over history, with common sense about these things, and people work out ways of dealing with change that actually end up by working really quite well. It may not surprise you to know that I don't agree with absolutely everything that the SNP believes. But my own experience of discussions, for example, with John Swinney, with whom I have various discussions about various matters, is that it's entirely possible to have a sensible, civilized, mutually respectful conversation and come to a sensible conclusion about practical, operational issues. And indeed, that's been our experience as we've gone through repeated and sometimes very difficult patches where we're sitting in COBRA meetings and there are issues in Scotland and issues in Wales and issues in England, and we involve the devolved administrations. There's a perfectly workmanlike relationship. So I'm hugely optimistic, actually, that all of the things which we're describing will continue to exhibit this tendency of evolving in a way that keeps our stable liberal democracy stable and liberal and democratic. And that is the abiding purpose of our Constitution. As Peter says, what I want to talk about today actually is to do with England, an area of the country in which the government in Westminster is the government for all purposes, rather than just for those purposes which are reserved or not transferred or whatever. And I think there's been much more attention hitherto paid to the much wider questions about Britain's relationship with the EU, Britain's relationship with international conventions such as human rights, Britain's internal constitutional arrangements vis-à-vis the different nations within the UK, than there has on the question of England's own constitutional arrangements. And I think it's really important that we should attend to what has happened and is happening in England, because I think it is of real significance for the future. And I want to try to make an argument about what it is that I think is going on in this domain. And I want to start actually somewhere which is not to do with the Constitution specifically, but is to do with how we're governed. I see at the back over there crept in Lord Norton, who has written about this, I think, very lucidly. A long time ago, he pointed out that one of the points about constitutions is that if they're working right, they enable governments to work better. And if they're working badly, a good sign of that is that the governments don't work very well. Now, if you think back some years, and I know that, alas, I'm getting to the stage where most of the people in this room are younger than I am, but looking around, there are quite a lot of other people who were alive long enough to remember this phase. You'd be able to remember ministers of the 1997 and following Labour administrations, including the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, talking quite frequently about the need to join up government. I don't know if you recall that phrase. I certainly recall hearing it on frequent occasions. I doubt he was the first Prime Minister to talk about that, and we've certainly been talking about it since. And I've certainly read all sorts of people in all sorts of journals over time, and heard people at all sorts of meetings talking about the need to join things up. And they're quite right. He was right, they're right. One of the big issues about government is how do you join it up? Why is this a big issue about government? Well, because actually people don't come in fragments. A person comes as a whole. So they're not, there's not a bit of a person floating out there that is a pensioner, and another bit of the person that is a patient, and another bit of the person that is a pupil, and so on. One person comes as a whole. But government can't deal with all aspects of a person at once, and so it divides into, in every country that I know of, it divides into departments and agencies and the like, and each of these deals with a fragment of, from the point of view of any given one of the citizens, the personality of that citizen. And because people come whole and governments come in parts, it can very often be the case that if you don't watch out, one bit of government is doing something which, from the point of view of that person, is not consistent with what another bit of the government is doing vis-à-vis that person. And this is a universal experience across the world. There's nothing special about these issues in Britain. I next want to draw your attention to the fact that it wasn't just that people were talking about this at the turn of the millennium. They were trying to do something about it. There were all sorts of committees set up to try to join up government. Now, I see around this room some very distinguished and senior civil servants who, because they're civil servants, I won't, or ex-civil servants, I won't embarrass them by mentioning their names, but they will have sat at many committees. And they will have seen just how effective committees are at joining up departments. Of course, at the level of making a specific decision, it is perfectly possible to get different departments to be represented in a committee and to talk through the decision in a sensible way and to hear the views taken by the representatives of those departments from different perspectives, and at least under a chair who's good at doing this, and actually our civil service is very good at facilitating this, to arrive at a single decision that properly balances the views of many. Of course, this is one of the joys of operating in Britain is that we actually, I mean, I know it's unfashionable to say so, but actually our civil service is rather good, and it's rather good at doing that sort of thing, and it's been doing it for a very long while, and it works okay. The course, that's not really the same as joining things up in the sense that I was referring to or that people were complaining about back at the turn of the millennium. Because for Mrs. Jones, who is a patient and a pensioner, shall we say, and maybe also having a housing problem, the fact that someone has made a decision in one of those domains that has paid some attention to the concerns in other domains doesn't mean that she gets a result that is coherent for her. And if you want an example of where that is at its most acute and most significant for our society today, I think undoubtedly it's the case of the interaction of health and social care. Anybody who is seriously concerned, as anybody who's concerned about our country must be, with the ability of this country to sustain the NHS and to sustain our social care system and to deal with the problems that are generated by an aging population, is bound to recognize that one of the great issues facing this country today is the increasing numbers of us, I'm heading in that direction myself, who are going to be frail and elderly and who need to be cared for in one way or another. And if those who are frail and elderly are cared for in a way which is genuinely joined up, and if investments are made in a sensible way in preventative measures that enable them to stay healthy and at home, the consequences for them and the consequences for society as a whole and the taxpayer are incalculably large. The appalling sequence of something going wrong, a frail elderly person ending up in A&E, that person being admitted to emergency admission, being treated often brilliantly by the NHS, going back home, not being adequately supported, ending up having another problem or fall or whatever, going back into A&E, going back into emergency admission, and ending up going into residential care, is not just a tragic sequence for a person and the family that surrounds them in all too many cases. It's also a huge cost for the NHS and for social care, and is one of the great questions of our age because of the increasing numbers of us who, very splendidly from another point of view, are living longer. And trying to knit together the vast complexities of the healthcare system with the very considerable complexities of the social care system in such a way that a frail elderly person receives coherent, effective, timely, preventative care that prevents that sort of sequence is a very significant challenge. I hope that what I've just been saying is completely obvious to everybody and that I don't need to make any further argument for that. We now come to the question, how do you achieve that kind of joining up? You can't do that by having a committee, or just by having a committee that has conversations. It's a very important thing to do, to have conversations about that and to try to work out mechanisms, but you can't join up Mrs. Smith's care in a particular street, in a particular town or city of our country by having a committee meeting in Whitehall. That's, I take it, evident to everyone in this room that does not compute. For the thing to be joined up, a large number of individuals who are engaged in very specific activities at the local level need to join up their activities in a sensible, coherent whole that addresses her concerns as a whole person in a way that makes sense for her and for the system as a whole. And achieving that kind of cultural change, getting very, very large numbers of professionals to be able not just to use their very considerable individual skills, but to join together in the way that they use those skills so as to achieve that kind of hugely desirable result for the particular person involved is something that requires a great deal more than just some committee in Whitehall. So how do you achieve it? Now this is where I rejoin the point I'm trying to make about the constitutional arrangements within Britain. Because if we apply the Norton test, we ask, is our constitution within England such as to facilitate the bringing together of the people that are dealing with Mrs. Smith's case in a way that will benefit Mrs. Smith, then I think you have to answer that question, certainly if you look back a few years, by saying that the structures of government in England were not well calculated to achieve that kind of joining up, and that is, I think, why Tony Blair and others in the turn of the millennium speeches were complaining so much about their own government's inability to join things up. It wasn't because people were stupid or people were ill-willed. It was because the structures of government made it extremely difficult to see how, at the operational level, you could actually get people into the kind of discussions and activities that brought things together for the particular person that the public services were trying to help. It's from that perspective, rather than from the perspective of any ideological ambition or any dogma or any theory, that we are fundamentally, and have been now for some time, fundamentally trying to reorganize the relationship between the citizen and the state within England. This is very much work in progress, and therefore it's also has many, many aspects. Many of us have been thinking about it one way or another for a very long time. My colleague at the back, John Penrose, the Minister for Constitutional Reform, wrote many years ago with Jeremy Hunt and others. There was a very powerful work about localization. There was a great deal of thinking about this in the years succeeding the millennium, both within the Conservative Party and outside it. And during the time that we found ourselves in office, both in coalition and now in a majority government, we have been pursuing pretty steadily an agenda to try to resolve these questions of the joining up of government and its services in a different way from the model of having a committee in Whitehall. The fundamental perception underlying our approach is that if you want to get all the people who are concerned with the care of Mrs. Smith, or all the people who are trying to organise things so that it's less likely that there should be flooding in a particular village in North Dorset, or all the people who are trying to make sure that a particular community is able to plan its future, its housing, its infrastructure, so on, in a sensible, rational way, or indeed all the people anywhere who are trying to do anything together in a joined-up way, we're trying to get that result. A good starting point, and this is our fundamental point, a good starting point is to transfer, as far as possible, the levers of power, the levers of being able to do things and make things happen, to a point very, very close to the point where those people are themselves. There's been lots of jargon attached to this, but the thought is nevertheless expressed in phrases like place-based and localized and devolved and so on. What it's about is trying to shift the scene of the action to a point at which the people who are having the discussion have all sorts of things you can't possibly have sitting miles away from the action and trying to deal with things that concern 55 million fellow citizens. If you are in a place, if you know that place, if you know many of the people who are doing the things that you're trying to discuss, if you know the circumstances they face and the constraints that they operate under, if you know the tensions that surround these things and the difficulties that there are in altering situations, you are much more likely to be able to put together a coherent solution that will actually, in practice, deliver the kind of coherent government or coherent public services that I'm talking about. That is our fundamental perception. Of course, before I go on, I should note, in case it's sort of troubling you at the back of your mind, that there will be all sorts of instances in which the background conditions set by the state centrally, in this case by Parliament and by the government, will have an effect on the ability of the locals to act. So I don't mean at all that once you have transferred considerable power to a locality, you have produced a magic solution that will avoid you having to think about whether the background circumstances you're creating for the nation as a whole will enable the people in that locality to pursue this agenda of joining things up effectively in the interests of their community. Nevertheless, it's a lot easier to imagine governments over many decades, which is what we have to think of in terms of constitutions, I think, setting good background conditions if they're not also trying to operate the foreground, the immediate, from remote control from a very long way away, but have instead allowed people at the scene of the action to make the kinds of decisions that enable them to do so in a coherent fashion. The next point I want to make is that although our fundamental perception is that the locus of activity being shifted is the single biggest thing we can do to promote the chances of coherent action and joining things up sensibly, that's not the only reason for shifting the locus of activity. There is something else here involved. And that is that although we're all part of one country, and while we're at it, part of one globe, and although it's incredibly important that we think of ourselves in that way as together being citizens of one country and indeed citizens of one planet, and for all sorts of reasons we need to think in those terms, we are also, at any given time in our lives, located in a place, and we have a particular set of concerns and desires and preferences, which are the preferences and desires and concerns of the people of that place. Now, that isn't to say, of course, that any group of people in one place all have the same preferences and desires. Anybody who's been involved in politics as long as I have knows very well that within a hamlet you can generate huge opposition, perhaps in some ways more intense than you can get at any other level of activity. But nevertheless, even when disputes rage within a village, if you can get the villagers to concentrate on what they agree about rather than what they disagree about, you would find that a very, very large proportion of them actually agree about a very, very great deal about how their place ought to be. It won't be the same as the views that will be taken in some other place about how that place ought to be. I'm always, I can just make a brief excursion, I'm always enormously impressed and astonished by the depth of historical attachment in our country. There are towns in Britain, and in England specifically, which were royalist in the Civil War, which is a long time ago. And there are towns which were parliamentarian in the Civil War. And there are towns that were on the side of Monmouth's rebellion and towns that were not. And there are, if you go to those towns, there's no reason why somebody who didn't know about British history should conceivably think that there would be a particular cast of mind connected with those historical events still in the 21st century. But let me tell you, there are. It's still the case that particular attitudes in political parties are to be found dominating in places where those political parties' connections can be traced all the way back to these ancient events. Now, why is that? Is that because, if you grow up in a particular place that was royalist in the Civil War, you kind of, when you're born, somebody comes and whispers things in your ear that make you feel, of course it isn't. It's actually because, I speculate, the people who come to that place partly because the character of that place, and the character of that place has been formed by the people that were last in it. And so actually it doesn't always happen, things change, but there is a tendency that a place will retain a character because the people who like that character are the people who come to that. Of course, if we lived in a totalitarian state where we move people around as they used to in the old Soviet Union, it would be very different. But people in our country, thank goodness, can choose where to live to a very great extent, and therefore these patterns subsist. So actually, the characters of different places are different. And when I say different places, I mean right down to the level of neighborhoods. The characters of neighborhoods within towns and cities vary from one another. And that's certainly true the length and breadth of our country and its different appearances as rural and suburban and urban and so on. So there's another reason, besides the question of joining up things, being easier at a local level, for trying to get to the point where people run their own lives more. And that's because that allows them collectively to determine, express, and then make a reality of their own preferences about their own place, which, while they will be various, are likely to be different in some, once balanced out, from the preferences of another place equally treated. And let me give you an exact example of that. I think it's one of the most striking things that happen in our country, but forgive me those from the press here, I've never seen anyone write about it. I don't expect that at the end of this anyone will write about it. I've never managed to interest anybody in it, but it's one of the most interesting phenomena in our country. Some years back, when we were trying to work out this was when we were in opposition, we were trying to work out how do you get to a position that is true in many other countries in Europe, for example in France, the Netherlands, where local communities tend to welcome housing. Just think of that proposition. Local communities tend to welcome housing. In our country, the pattern had been for a very long while that housing is something which you could more or less rely on the locals not wanting to have in their locality and setting up metaphorical machine gun nests to repel. Housing was coming down upon them from outside, they thought, and they didn't like this happening to them, and everyone here must surely have had the sense, certainly any politician here will have had the sense of people gathering, not on party political grounds, but just joining together to repel invaders. It's very destructive because we need many more houses in this country, and we need people to welcome those houses and not to reject them. So we're asking ourselves a pretty profound question: how do you switch that culture? And we came to the conclusion that if you want to shift that culture, you almost certainly have to give the people of the locality the power to make a decision about the character of the housing, the placing of the housing, the things that go with the housing and everything else associated with it, because then they become quite different people. They aren't thinking about how to form the campaign group or set up the machine gun nests. They switch their minds around and ask themselves the question, what do we and our children and our grandchildren need in this place? What is it sensible to do? What would it need to look like and feel like and be like to cohere with the character of the place as we want it to be? Let's get together and think about that. And when we had those thoughts and we set out a program to institute neighborhood planning, almost anybody that said anything about it, there weren't very many people even noticed, said it will never work, will never happen, no one will take it on, people aren't capable of this. If people are capable of this, they'll fall to quarrelling. It will lead to everybody being NIMBYist and stopping housing and so on and so forth. Fact, it isn't that way. There are now, I can't remember the exact figure, but more than 1,500 communities in our country that are engaged in neighborhood planning, right the way from inner city areas to the most rural villages. I think the number of inhabitants covered now by neighborhood planning is greater than 6 million. I may even be too small a figure because that's a few months out of date. and a certain number of these, I think at the last look, 60 or 70 of them have completed. And that's a long process, because you have to sit together and work out what it is you're trying to achieve. You have to understand the background conditions, exactly as I was describing, set by the law and by central government. You can't just say, I'm going to build things in sites of special scientific interest, or not do the number of houses that the local plan determines for this place, but you can do more. You can't disobey building regulations and so on. So there are all sorts of background conditions. You've got to sort all that out. Then you've got to sort out between the people in the neighbourhood what is something they think is reasonable, where it should be, how it should look. And then you've got to go through the process of getting that approved as conforming with the law, and then, most important of all, you have to go to a referendum, a local referendum. What has been the experience of those plans that have come to fruition? I can't remember the exact figure, but I think in every referendum, if I remember correctly, there's been a positive vote of over 80%. It may even be over 85%. Many, it's been 90, 95%. Huge proportions of the neighbourhoods that have voted have come out to vote. Everyone said nobody would bother. It's just not true. Meetings, I've attended some of them myself in various parts of the country to discuss neighbourhood planning, engage the sentiments of the locals in a way that anybody who actually knows how important people think this is to their locality would have guessed, but which very many people in the past said would never happen. And of course, it also turns out that in almost every neighbourhood there are spirits that are people that have the capacity to lead and to help, and to, of course, we provide some support to help facilitate, but actually it's the locals, by and large, who find their leaders, and those leaders lead. And they end up with a solution which they approve of in a referendum. And now let me tell you a really astonishing fact, which is in every single case, at least when I last looked at the figures, the approved number of houses in the referendum has been greater than the number that they were compelled to produce by the relevant local plan. People, when they are given the power, make a rational decision about the evolution of their place and accept it and welcome it in a way that they never would if somebody told them from outside what to do. Which is exactly what happens in France and the Netherlands and Germany, and that's why we thought it would work, and it does. So we now have 3 reasons on our hands for thinking that shifting the scene of action from Westminster to locality is a powerful device for improving the relationship between the state and the citizen. There's the fact that you can join things up in a coherent fashion. I think what Manchester is doing with health and social care, for example, is a very, very clear instance of that. There's the fact that you can much more easily adapt the strategies and services and decisions of the place to preference of that place. And there's the fact that people, once they take the power in their hands, cease to regard government as a thing from outside that's to be feared or worried about or resisted or cynical about. Instead, act in a thoroughly grown-up way and begin to consider their own future as active citizens. I wrote some years ago about the neighbourly society. I can't think of anything you can do more effectively to generate the neighbourly society than to enable people to take the life of their community more into their own hands. Now, I don't want to tediously rehearse the details of a whole series of measures that we've taken to try to engender this shift, but just to glance over the many, many things that are going on, all of which tend in the same direction. They're not all the same thing. It's not a sort of systematic textbook exercise. It's something which we've designed to be flexible and responsive and heavily driven from the bottom up. We aren't telling people whether they have neighbourhood plans. We've enabled them to have them, and then they decide whether to have them. We haven't told people whether to have mayors or combined authorities or to do deals with Greg Clark. They decide whether they want to. So it's unashamedly and intentionally flexible and variable in its geometry, but it all tends in the same direction. The deals that Peter mentioned, the neighbourhood planning that I've talked about, the increased ability of communities to do a whole series of things which they weren't able to do before for themselves, the handing over of the finance of local government increasingly into the hands of local government so that money is raised locally and not centrally, and so that they have powers of universal powers of competence, which we instituted early in the last Parliament, an unrestricted field of activity, therefore, for local governments, constrained only by the law, just as you and I can't murder or steal, so local governments can't do those things, but they can do anything that you and I can do. Whereas in the past, if they wanted to do something, they had to apply for permission, or they had to have a statute which gave them the vires, and there was a whole series of things which were, and I quote, ultra vires, no longer. There's, alongside that, these huge shifts of things like health and social care down to the level where they can be done in a coherent way that, as I say, we're already observing in Manchester and we will see more of in other parts of the country. And of course it goes alongside the vanguards that Simon Stevens has been promoting and much else besides. And that goes alongside the movement to the local economic partnerships, the LEPs, which are really totally different in concept from the old regional development agencies. They are not an emanation of central government making decisions about a region. They are people from the locality making decisions about their priorities and connecting those with local government and local business. And of course, the neighbourhood planning that I described is in the same mode. And the next point I want to make is that if you look at all of those different things, and you look at everything that's so far happened, I think what is really exciting here is that is just the beginning. This is a process and not a single action, nor even a set of actions that happen and stop. This is a process of gradually deepening the ability of people in England to take power locally, to exercise it in a way that meets their preferences and can produce coherent results in the light of their circumstances so that they act in a certain way and feel about themselves in a certain way. And it's therefore not a constitutional shift which somebody has dreamt up in some academic lecture room because it looks neat on a piece of paper. It's, on the contrary, a process that gradually empowers our communities and thereby empowers our citizens. And that, I think, is a phenomenally important shift, which will have incalculable consequences over decades, which we'll only really fully understand, I think, decades and decades from now. Let me say just one last thing. I've mentioned what I think are the practical advantages of this process. And I think they're very, very considerable. In some cases, like the case of health and social care, they are crucial to the sustaining of our most important public services. In other cases, they are very important indeed, from a practical point of view. But actually, it goes beyond that. There is also a question about how we feel about ourselves as human beings. And I draw your attention to a very, very interesting set of studies that were done in Switzerland some while ago. A set of Swiss economists set about in a very efficient way, as you might expect in Switzerland, to investigate the question What makes people happy? Nice, simple question, which Richard Layard has been thinking about for many years. Well, they went about it in a very sort of systematic way. And because they were economists and they were, in some cases, econometricians, they did regression analyses. And they tried to correlate all sorts of things with happiness. And so let me just tell you something very important, which if Richard Layard were here, he would tell you, and then you might believe it, but if you don't believe me, read his books, and then you might believe it. There's an amazing fact about happiness. It's one of the very few things which, if people tell you about, they're usually telling you the truth. Descartes once observed that in a quite different domain, there's a commodity which nobody seems to lack, which is wisdom, because he'd never heard anybody complaining of having too little of it. But that may not always be true. But in the case of happiness, if somebody tells you they're happy, that's a very, very good approximation to knowing they're happy. I don't mean literally day by day, but if an earnest investigator goes and asks them, by and large it turns out to be true. And what Richard did was to investigate objective correlates of happiness, and it turned out when people were saying they were happy, pretty much on any objective correlate, it looked like they were happy, and if they said they were unhappy, pretty much on any objective correlate, they were unhappy. So what these researchers who knew about that sort of stuff did was to ask people, well, whether they were happy or not, and then look at all the other circumstances that lay behind. And they looked at whether they had, whether they were rich or whether they were poor, whether they were in stable relationships or not, and all sorts of things that you and I would guess might be determinants of happiness. And indeed, unsurprisingly, it turned out there were some correlations between almost everything and happiness. What was the thing they found was most correlated to happiness? This was a real surprise. Turned out actually it was to do with how far people were able to run their own lives. Now I say that's a real surprise. It's a real surprise if you don't think very hard. And actually when you do think very hard and somebody's mentioned this to you, it's blindingly obvious. Because if you don't apply it to humanity in general, but you actually think about your own life, think about what happens to you day by day, and what really gets you. What really gets you is when you can't do what you want to do. What gives those of us who, I suspect is true of everybody in this room, incredibly privileged and lucky, such a quality of life is not actually the fact that we have more money than most of the people in the world and that we have all sorts of other favourable circumstances. Those are very important things. It's actually that we probably, most of the people in this room, maybe everyone in this room, is this incredible privilege to live a life in which broadly you wake up in the morning and you do things which, although there may be some bores on the way, broadly are things you want to do. This is what makes us feel fulfilled and happy. And that's what they found. And they found that in cantons where people had a greater degree or felt that they had a greater degree of control over their own lives, they were on average happier than in cantons where they didn't, or did so less so. And so, in the end, what I'm describing is not just something which is instrumental in its purposes, not just that we're trying to achieve some good practical results about managing public services so that they are joined up. It's not just that we're trying to enable communities to decide better how they achieve their collective preferences, so that's also very important. It's not even just that we're trying to get to a point where people's attitude to government is that they have some power and therefore they can behave in a mature, sensible, rational way in determining their own future, though that's very important. It's also that I think this shift is likely to make people in Britain over the long haul happier. I think people will be more satisfied with their lives if they feel that they have more control over their lives in the place they live in, rather than thinking that somebody else, somewhere else, that they may occasionally be able to vote out of office, but otherwise they have no real connection with, and it has hundreds of thousands of people active all over the country in some incomprehensible way, is running their lives for them. So the argument I'm making today is that there is a very profound series of constitutional shifts within England going on, that relatively few people have really noticed the importance of this, that it is in fact very important, and that it's hugely beneficial, and that it's work in progress. And that if we pursue it in a consistent fashion over a long period, we will probably make people in this country happier, which is in the end what we're all in politics to try and do. Thank you.